Can doctors from the US work in Australia? Well, the answer is yes, and I'm going to show you how and why in this video. In this video, I'm going to take you through the statistics and the steps involved so that if you're a doctor from the United States thinking about working down under, you're better informed. Hello there, I'm Dr. Anthony Wellen, the Career Doctor, basically a bit of a medical HR geek, here to help you with your medical career, whether that be on Facebook, YouTube or LinkedIn. Today we're talking about doctors from the US working in Australia. And whilst the number of inquiries for help that I've had from US doctors is slightly less than, say, for example, UK doctors, the prospect for US doctors working in Australia are pretty much on a par with that from the UK. Which reminds me, if you're thinking about coming to Australia to work as a doctor, for any reason, you might want to book one of my risk-free strategy calls where we can hop on a Zoom call and go over your particular situation in greater detail. And at this very moment, I'm also offering free strategy calls to well-qualified doctors. So you can check out the links to both of these calls in the description below, as well as some other handy links and references. Now, no doctor coming from another country is guaranteed to be able to work in Australia, but because the US medical training system is recognised by the Medical Board of Australia as being on a par with that of Australia, US doctors tend to have good success with achieving full registration here. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the pathways you would have to go through if you're considering working in Australia from the US, and we'll be particularly looking at the competent authority pathway as well as a bit around the specialist pathway. And I'll also touch on the other pathway, the short-term training pathway. I will start with trainee doctors first, but if you're a specialist from the US, you'll also want to watch all the way through, as you need to know about the competent authority pathway as well as the specialist pathway. I'll also dig into the statistics around US doctors so you can get a feel for what your own personal chances might be, and share with you a few tips that would be worth you considering if you're thinking of making the move here. And finally, at the end, I will deal with some common related questions that come up when we're talking about US doctors working in Australia, such as, is osteopathic medicine recognised in Australia? The competent authority pathway is the option for most US trainee doctors. If you're a trainee doctor in the US, a resident who has not yet achieved specialty status, then you are looking at the competent authority pathway for working in Australia. The competent authority pathway assigns preferential status to any doctor who has completed their primary medical training in one of 4 countries: the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States and the Republic of Ireland. The rationale for this is largely an historical one and based on the premise that all these jurisdictions have had similar approaches to medical school training and similar standards. Now, New Zealand is not included in the list above, as its medical schools are accredited by the same body as Australian ones, the AMC. So doctors from New Zealand in Australia are generally treated identically to those from Australia. Now, if you're an international medical graduate and you have achieved general registration in the United States, you're also eligible for the competent authority pathway. But there are a few catches to that. So what are the steps involved for the competent authority pathway? You can find out more about the competent authority pathway on my blog site, as well as on the Medical Board of Australia website. The key steps are as follows. Firstly, securing an employment offer. Secondly, applying to the Australian Medical Council for primary source verification. That's verifying your medical degree. Thirdly, applying for registration to the Medical Board of Australia. Fourthly, completing 12 months supervised practice here in Australia. And finally, fifth, applying again to the Medical Board of Australia for general registration. The essential requirements are, firstly, successful completion of the United States medical licensing examinations, all steps, step 1, 2 and 3, and successful completion of a minimum of 2 years of graduate medical education within a residency program that must be accredited by the Accreditation Council of Graduate Medical Education. If you graduated prior to 1992, then there are similar requirements for the pre-existing national board system. Now, the net effect of the final requirement, which is to complete a minimum 2 years of graduate medical education, means that doctors who have trained in US accredited medical schools outside of the United States sometimes find it difficult to come to Australia via this pathway. As do IMG doctors who have completed the US MLE but also not been able to gain a job in the USA. Now, what types of jobs can I apply for as a US trainee? You can pretty much apply for any sort of trainee job. There are often a number of postgraduate year 2 or 3 or plus general jobs on offer, which are generally termed here as resident medical officer in most states and territories, which are generally termed resident medical officer positions in most states and territories. But they might also be called something like house officer or hospital medical officer in some places. Now, above these posts normally come the specialty training positions. Australia is a bit different from the US in that we have a period between medical school and specialty training before we get into specialty training. So these positions at specialty level are called registrar positions, but you might also see them advertised as things like senior house officer role or advanced trainee role. One key thing to look out for is that most of these jobs, when you see them online, will not accept an overseas applicant. A key thing to look for, and the magic words are eligible for registration in the selection criteria. It is very important to try and secure an employment offer. While you can apply to the Australian Medical Council to check your medical degree at any stage, you won't be able to gain registration until you have an offer of employment. This is because the medical board needs to see a supervision plan from your employer. Outside of general practice, which is what we call family medicine here in Australia, the majority of employment opportunities for trainee doctors occur within public hospitals. So your best place for finding suitable job postings are on the State and Territory Health Department recruitment sites. I have a listing of these on my International Doctors Resource page. The other thing I should mention here is that often the medical recruitment companies will be happy to work with a trainee doctor from one of these competent authority countries, and they may have an understanding of additional openings that you might not be able to find listed anywhere, so it's worth thinking about contacting one of them. Now, what type of supervision will you need or get? Well, the Medical Board of Australia is very vigilant around supervision standards for IMG doctors. The sort of supervision you'll receive will depend on a number of factors, including your qualifications, your previous experience, especially in the type of position you're working in, and whether you've practiced recently and the scope of your recent practice. In general, you will either be approved for level 1 or level 2 supervision. There are 4 levels, and the higher up you go, the less direct oversight you require or get. Level 1 supervision requires your supervisor or alternate to be present in the hospital or practice with you at all times, and you must consult with them about all patients. Remote supervision, for example by telephone, is not permitted under this circumstance. So level 1 is generally recommended when you are very junior yourself or entering a very junior role which you're not very familiar with. In Australian major public hospitals, there are many layers of other doctors who you can get supervision from. So level 1 is not too much of an issue in these circumstances. Level 2 supervision is actually the one that most US trainee doctors will be approved to work in Australia. And it's basically a step up from level 1 supervision. Supervision must primarily be in person, but your supervisor can leave you to do work on your own, and you can discuss things by phone. You should discuss with them on a regular daily basis what you've been doing with patients, but you don't need to discuss each and every case. What happens after you commence your position? Well, once you are approved for registration, you have your visa issues sorted, you'll be able to commence work. Generally, your employer helps you with all these things. You'll be working under what is called provisional registration by the Medical Board of Australia. Generally, all you need to do for this 12 months is to pay attention, show that you can learn and grow, and get regular feedback from your supervisors. Your supervisors will need to complete regular reports for the Medical Board of Australia, and it is your responsibility, not theirs, to see that they are completed and returned on time. If all the reports go well, you will be able to be recommended at the end of the 12 months for general registration. You'll probably be starting to look for another job or negotiating an extension around this time. With general registration, you may be able to apply for a skilled visa, as well as be looking at applying for a permanent residency. Permanent residency is crucial for applying for some specialty training programs. The specialist pathway is the option for US specialists. For US specialists, your option for working in Australia is what is called the specialist pathway. Once again, this starts with becoming verified as a doctor with the Australian Medical Council and should again coincide with an active search for a position. You may be lucky enough to be in a targeted specialty area where you might successfully be approved for what is called an area of need position, although these are very rare these days. In which case, the employer or recruitment agent will provide you a lot of support and will likely pick up a lot of the costs involved. But for most international doctor specialists these days, you will be approaching the college directly firstly to be assessed before an employer will look at you. This is not something to be trifled with. The paperwork requirements, in my experience, and the cost, this is not something to be trifled with. In my experience with dealing with specialist doctors, helping them with this process, the paperwork requirements are enormous and take a lot of time, and the costs, which generally start around $5,000 Australian to be assessed and more, are very considerable. On the plus side, the colleges all have reasonably helpful information on their websites, including the application forms and a little bit about their criteria for assessment. I've saved you the trouble of finding a lot of this information by putting them on my International Doctors Resource page, which you can find a link to in the description below, and I'll post a link here as well. Now, the other issue for US specialists is that there are more than twice the number of specialists Now, a small confusing issue for US specialists can be that there are more than twice the number of specialties in the US than there are in Australia. So working out which specialty goes into which Australian college can be a little bit confusing, and you may want to take a strategy call with me to help with that. Fortunately, I've covered you in a post on that here as well, which I'll link in the description below as well. After you go through your specialist assessment, you are given an outcome. In the majority of cases for US specialists, you are deemed either to be partially comparable or substantially comparable. Rarely are you deemed not to be comparable by the college. If you are, this means you cannot directly become a specialist in Australia, and if you still want to work here, you'll have to go through the competent authority route and then re-enter training. So exactly how many US doctors are working in Australia? Well, there's no one public data source to tell us how many US doctors are currently working here in Australia. However, from data collected by the Australian government, we know a few things. For example, the number of US doctors who were granted provisional registration in the year 2018 was 24 out of 26 doctors, so a pretty good rate. And the number of US doctors who were granted specialist comparability in 2019 was 14 out of 17, so again pretty good chances. Now, other questions you may have. Can you enter training in Australia if you're a US doctor? To undertake formal specialty training in Australia, you do need to be accepted into a college training program. In all circumstances, you will need at least general registration. You might need permanent residency for some programs as well. There is an alternative but time-limited pathway for US doctors who are just seeking a short-term experience in Australia to add to their training in the US. This is called the short-term training in a medical specialty pathway. To do this, you must be offered a position for training, not an actual training position as per a college. And you have to have that first. And you must have either completed your training in the US or be less than 2 years from completion. So this is a program mainly for early career specialists or advanced trainees from the United States, as well as other countries, obviously. You will not be able to apply for specialist assessment as part of this pathway, and it is limited to 2 years. Can you do your internship in Australia as a US doctor? Basically, the answer to this question is no. Internship in Australia is a provisional year that only applies to medical graduates from medical schools in Australia and New Zealand. There is a loophole which only applies to doctors who have not been able to complete an internship or equivalent in their own country and in some other small circumstances. But the medical board itself warns that this is not a great option and is only granted in limited cases. You're far better off starting your ACGME residency program in the US and applying to work in Australia after doing 2 years or more in the United States. Are osteopathic doctors recognised in Australia? I got this question recently and the answer is yes. The degree of a Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine, or DO USA, is a medical qualification that is recognised for the purposes of medical registration by many international registration authorities, including Australia. How hard is it to become a specialist in Australia if you're coming from the United States? Well, specialist doctors from the United States are not automatically granted specialist recognition. We've talked about that already. However, in 2019, there were 17 applications made for specialist assessment to the Australian colleges by US doctors, and of these, 14 were deemed to be comparable. So that's a pretty good rate. In the previous year of 2018, only one application out of 20 was deemed to not be comparable. US doctors tend to get a reasonably favourable outcome in comparison to doctors from most other countries. However, many are being seen by the colleges as partially comparable only, which involves more work and effort to then get to the final step and level of specialist recognition. Are there any particular specialties that are easier to apply for? Look, the majority of specialties have some vacancies and will provide some opportunities for US and other IMG doctors from time to time here in Australia. This is particularly the case if you're prepared to go outside of the major cities. Some areas of medicine are more popular, and so finding jobs in areas such as most surgical fields, for example, as well as other fields such as things like cardiology, can be quite difficult, and it's always worth getting a bit of advice. On the other end of the spectrum, general practice, psychiatry, and most parts of critical care medicine are often always looking for additional doctors. Are there any other options for working as a doctor in Australia? Well, some doctors just want to come to Australia for a bit of experience, a bit of limited period of time, as an opportunity to see what it's like to work as a doctor in another country. And as I've highlighted already, there is an alternative but time-limited pathway for US doctors who are just wanting that sort of experience on the short term. Finally, just a few tips if you are a US doctor thinking about embarking on this process. First tip would be to think about the fact that your employment documents will look quite different from what an Australian employer might be looking for right here. It's always worth getting a bit of advice about whether your CV or resume is being presented in the right format. This can be quite critical if you're looking to get a job interview for a position. My second tip is, as I've already mentioned in a number of my other videos, if you're prepared to look across Australia for jobs, your opportunities for jobs are going to be much better. If you're very targeted on working in a particular major capital city, you might find it's difficult to get a position. Most of the excess jobs, the places that are looking for doctors from overseas, tend to be outside those major centres. The third tip is some of the paperwork involved with some of these pathways can be a little bit confusing, and you might want to get some advice and help from an expert. Now, you might be able to get that through a medical recruitment company, but this is something that I also offer coaching calls around. And that leads to my final point. As I've mentioned a couple of times in this video already, sometimes the medical recruitment companies will be in touch with the employers and know about positions that aren't well advertised in other places. And they're always on the lookout for good, high quality doctors. One of the countries that they'll be looking for is doctors from the United States. So in the link in the description below, if you're interested in maybe connecting up with a medical recruitment company, I've got a quick survey you can take to see if you might be eligible for such a situation. So I hope you found that this video about US doctors working in Australia was useful. If you have any questions or queries or just want to relate your experience, please put them in the comments below. If you're watching on YouTube, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. And remember, you can book a quick strategy call to discuss with me your personal situations further. See you in the next video.